Though we have varying opinions in this class, I think we may all agree that the Bible is a powerful material artifact for our modern day society. So much so that we often find the biblical text revered as a handbook of sorts for social relationships. This is particularly true for family relationships, as evidenced by the fact that passages of the Bible are often quoted to affirm the roles of and relationships between men, women, and children. Many romanticize the oft quoted, "Then the man said, 'This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of man this one was taken.' Therefore, a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh." While Psalm 127:3, "Sons are a heritage from the Lord, children a reward from him," affirms the value of male offspring. This scriptural reminder may serve as a stumbling block to some daughters and their mothers, or for impotent or barren couples. Texts like Malachi 2:16, which reads, "I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel," have been quoted to men and women living through abusive marriages. But this sentiment seems to contradict Proverbs 25:24, which decries, "Better to live on a corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife." Children are admonished to obey the lesson of Exodus 20:12. "Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you." While unsuspected women of Proverbs 31, while the unsuspecting woman of Proverbs 31 has become a burden far too heavy for many women to bear, yet she is the central figure of many women's conferences and Women's Day themes throughout the country. How then is a responsible biblicist to engage this ancient text, specifically foundational stories found in Genesis and the rest of the Torah, in matters of modern day community and social relationship? How do we rightly handle the text without doing violence to it or its adherents? How might we understand the social units of the time and of the patriarchs as we encounter the relational concerns today? These are questions of responsible hermeneutics. In this lecture, I will make you aware of the various social units of the Israelite context, relevant for an understanding of the background of the patriarchs found in Genesis 12 through 50. I will make 3 major moves in order to accomplish this lofty goal. I will quickly establish the physical environment markers for the early Israelites living in the hills of Palestine as depicted in Genesis 12 through 50. I do this because, as you will see, land and land tenure are central concerns of these narratives. Secondly, I will explicate the major social units of this time with attention to the Bet Av, the family, the clan, and tribe. Again, land seems to play a major role in the structure of this unit. Finally, I will interrogate the understanding of marriage during the time depicted in the narratives of the patriarchs, with an eye towards this custom's concern for the issue of land. I will do all this with particular concern for women, specifically daughters, in an effort to foreground your study of the narratives found in Genesis. For the early Israelites, living in the hills of the Levant or Palestine, as depicted in Genesis 12 through 50, the physical environment may be marked by topography, climate, and soil conditions. The terrain of this area was marked by rugged, steep hills and limited access to natural water deposits. For this society, the dearth of level land in the highland imposed restrictions on one's ability to produce crops. In response to this major terrain challenge, terracing provided a way for the land to be plowed and planted with cereal crops like wheat or barley, and also helped to reduce water runoff on the hillsides. Terracing increased the carrying capacity of the land by transforming the natural slopes into a series of level steeps or steps. These terraced steps were held in place by retaining walls built of dry laid stones that served as fields available for farming. Terracing was essential to the farming pursuits of the Iron Age, as without it, farming would not have been possible in some areas. At the same time, however, terracing brought with it human resource demands because terracing required considerable effort to construct and maintain. The ecological constraints of the extreme weather patterns, cold and rainy or hot and dry, associated with basically two seasons, also impacted early Israelites. The extreme climatological patterns made life in the Levant harsh. Winter rainfall was the chief water supply in most of the highland area, but the amounts of rainfall were intermittent. The volume of life-giving water was unpredictable one season or one year to the next. Along with rock terracing, therefore, agricultural success during this time was facilitated by technologies that included waterproof cisterns. Large cisterns, like the one shown here, were dug so as to retain water from the rainy season for use in the dry season. Most living compounds had one or more bell-shaped cisterns situated beneath the floors of houses or in courtyards. These were necessary, particularly in those settlements that were not located in very close proximity to natural water sources. Finally, the different types of soil produced in Palestine meant that no one area contained all of the soil types that contained all of the features needed for high crop yields. Some areas were saline rich or salty. Some contained browner or reddish soils, and some were full of limestone. This diversity of the soil is important for our understanding of social units and land tenure because it automatically set up a situation in which proprietary knowledge about the soil and its maintenance informed concerns about land inheritance. Said differently, if you grew up on a piece of land, a particular type of soil, helped your family care for and harvest that particular land and its respective foodstuffs, knew all the stories about how the land was used and misused over time, you were in the best position to maintain that land when your elders passed away. Clearly, land, its contours, its atmosphere, its soil-dependent production capabilities, played a major role in the lives of those depicted in the narratives of the patriarchs. These three major environmental markers all conspired to make living in the Levant extremely challenging for individuals during the period depicted in Genesis 12 through 50. Importantly, land was the major factor in production in antiquity, and wealth was measured in land. Therefore, control of land was an important issue. Moreover, their land-centric livelihood literally turned on the axis of interdependent people groupings. It is to these people groupings or social units that I now turn. I need to begin this portion of the lecture counterintuitively. Instead of treating the smallest social unit first and moving concentrically to treat the larger people groupings, I attend to the broadest conceptualization of social kinship assemblages first. Although the birth of Jacob's sons, as recorded in Genesis 29 through 30, and the groupings of those sons' lineage as tribes are periodically listed in Numbers, there's really not much mention of any sort of tribal system and this system structure in the Pentateuch in general or in Genesis in particular. There are at least 4 problems with the notion of tribe as a valid grouping of peoples, especially in the stories of the patriarchs, and they all fall under the heading of standards. Standards of definition and structure, quantification, inclusion, and geographic boundaries all problematize tribe as a social unit for the early Israelites. As it relates to definition and structure, although the biblical traditions point to the tribal structure for the period immediately preceding the rise of the state, nowhere in this material do we find an explanation of how the notion of tribe was conceptualized, what the composition of tribes was, or how the tribes related to one another on the economic and political levels. There's also the matter of the quantification of tribes. Some traditions, like the one found in Judges 1, suggests that the number of tribes composing pre-monarchic Israel was 12. But others, like the one found in Judges 5, only list 10. There are also the matters of inclusion, as there is textual evidence of tribes that are allied with Israel, but are never included in the list of tribes. Examples would include the Calebites and the Kenites. And then in 1 Samuel 25, Abigail's husband Nabal is described as a Calebite, and in Judges 4, Heber the Kenite is separated from the Kenites during battle with Barak. Fourthly, there's also no textual evidence of any precise geographical boundaries for the tribes. Many scholars argue convincingly that tribe is more of a literary convention than one grounded in historical veracity, allowing this kinship system, that the kinship systems are often expressed through genealogies, and that genealogies also serve as memory devices for keeping track of the relationships among individuals and groups, and used for ranking them in terms of inheritance and succession rights. I offer that many of the tribal genealogies in the Hebrew Bible are no doubt the result of secondary systemization, most likely of the exilic or post-exilic writers, constructed at the time they were written down and later incorporated into the narrative framework we now have before us. Despite these very valid challenges to the notion of tribe, what we do see prevalent in the story of the patriarchs, however, are the social units of family and clan. It is to these two groups that I now turn. The two Hebrew terms that occur most frequently in the biblical text that clearly refer to levels of social structure are Bet-Av and Mishpah. The terms in question are normally understood to designate the nuclear or extended family, the Bet-Av, and the clan, village, or lineage, the Mishpah. The Bet-Av, or family, is simply the most basic aggregation of individuals in pre-monarchic Israel, or to appropriate Carol Meyer's nomenclature, early Israel. This grouping served as the fundamental economic, subsistence producing, and social assemblage of the people living in the Levant. Because life was extremely harsh for persons living in the Levant during this time, its economic and subsistence role was significant. As a foundational social unit, then, the Bet Av, or family, was constructed or marked in such a way as to help manage the subsistence challenges presented by the harsh environment. The more, the merrier. The closer, the better. By way of sociological construction and definition, a Bet Av, or family household, was a co-residential group comprised of a married couple, any of their unmarried children, and servants. Widows living with a child or other elderly or otherwise incapacitated members would also fall within the definitional contours of family household. The family household, then, must include at minimum either two spouses and an offspring, or a widowed person and an offspring. An alternative label for this grouping is nuclear family. When more individuals who are relatives are added to the nuclear family grouping, it is referred to as an extended family household. Extended family households may be upwardly oriented. Additional kin are from a generation prior to the head of the household, for example, the father's mother, or downwardly oriented. The additional kin are from a generation after the head of household. Lastly, the term multiple family household refers to a domestic unit comprised of more than one conjugal pair in which the couples are linked through marriage or descent. Beyond the Genesis narratives, the biblical example of this type of family household would be that of Naomi and Elimelech, who reside with their sons Mahlon and Chilion and their wives Ruth and Orpah. Although the sociological definitions are fairly distinct, the Hebrew language presents these groupings as much more fluid. The same Hebrew word appears to apply to more than one of the groupings delineated in the social sciences. Clearly stated, Bet Av seems to apply to both the nuclear family household and the extended family household. Regardless of the complexity of the structure of any particular Bet Av, certain roles were consistent. In this societal structure, the male head of household, most often the father, hence the linguistic designation of Bet Av, or house of the father. In general, the roles of the pre-monarchic father were fivefold. The father was to protect and provide for his land and children, and was authorized to adopt sons and daughters, recruit workers, negotiate marriages, host strangers, and designate heirs. The father exercised the power of life and death in the household, but the authority was not absolute. His primary responsibility was for his wives and their sons and daughters. Moreover, because land and land tenure was so important for the early Israelite community in its patrilineal system, the father was authorized to hand over or bequeath the possessions of the household to another male from his side of the family. He generally handed over control to his own son, most frequently his firstborn son. As families in early Israel were patrilineal, meaning houses chose heirs only from the father's side. Fathers used progeniture or birth order to designate the male heir in order to achieve stability for their households. Zafira bin Barak simply classifies sons as the natural male offspring of the wives and concubines. The firstborn son was commonly accepted as the male legitimate heir of the paterfamilias, the one who would assume his place and authority after the father's death. Sons were responsible for ensuring the safety and security of elderly parents, as well as unmarried women, their sisters, and widowed females, under their residential auspices. Understandably, because the land inheritance generally transferred along the line of the male head of household, the role of the son or sons was important for the biblical writers. The mother played a critical role in the life of and livelihood of the early Israelites. Except for childbearing, nursing, and raising young children, qualitatively, a woman's contributions to the larger Bet Av was almost indistinguishable from those of a man. Archaeologist and biblical scholar Carol Myers reminds her readers that it is important for us to avoid the trap of looking at female household work as somehow less important than male tasks. Simply put, daughters were the female offspring of the household. In many ways, daughters were mini-me's of their mothers, but two main principles shaped the daughter's role. The first was that, as her father's offspring, he was obliged to provide for her and assure her future. The second was marriage. We will turn to marriage in a bit. For now, suffice it to say that the tension between the daughter's marriage and the primary concerns of the Bet Av, the father's name and memory, and the patrimony that was its economic, social, and legal status transferred from generation to generation, created a highly complex situation with implication for the daughter's legal status, especially for her inheritance rights within her father's house. Customs like the dowry, the bride price, and gifts evolved to protect her and her rights on one hand, and the integrity of her father's house on the other. By way of the work of archaeologists, we know that the physical dwellings of the Bet Av was most likely pillared houses. These bi-level houses were rectangular with a door that opened into a large living space that contained pillars, hence the designation pillared house, and doorways that led to other smaller rooms. Stairways, usually attached to the exterior walls, indicated upper rooms, most probably sleeping space. The houses appear in clusters of 2 or 3, with one or more walls in common, apparently sharing common courtyard space and presumably the activities carried out in that space. The presence of courtyard space in many of these dwellings leads scholars to believe that these individual dwellings were purposefully clustered together. The shared courtyard space and common house walls of linked buildings indicate some sort of larger people grouping. A large grouping that could manage its own subsistence needs. These compound families or extended family dwellings support our understanding of the Bet Av, and the grouping of these multi-generational, co-residential, related peoples suggests the presence of a larger social unit, a clan, a village, or a mishpachah. One way to conceptualize a mishpachah might be to think of it as that social unit that is larger than a bet av, made up of individuals who are related by way of extended lineage, maybe through marriage but not necessarily bloodline. Their lives that lives in close proximity to one another. The social scientist Norman Gottwald uses the term protective association of families, which conveys the dimension of local cooperation involved in the mishpachah. Residential kinship group or kinship group may best convey the nature of this village assemblage. Related families sharing common settled space and earning their livelihoods from the land, in the fields, the orchards, and the vineyards surrounding the village site. In the time that remains, I want to consider the function of marriage in an agrarian society in which land and land tenure were central. As the head of household, one of the responsibilities of the father is to transition his daughter or daughters safely into the house of another, her groom. As part of this safe transference, certain customs were developed to ensure that the daughter would be economically protected throughout her marriage and in the event of an untimely death of her husband. As stated earlier, customs like the dowry, the bride price, and gifts evolved to protect her and her rights on one hand, and the integrity of her father's house on the other. The dowry, the bride price, and gifts were part of the marriage custom that helped ensure the safety and security of the daughter. The dowry was what the father gave his daughter from the family possession and included movable property such as money, clothing, and furniture. The dowry was a transaction within the bet av between the father and the daughter and rarely included a plot of land. The dowry served two purposes. It confirmed the daughter's rights as a direct descendant to share in the property of her father's house, and it provided a shield against any physical injury, divorce, or widowhood. The bride price, or mohar, was paid by the groom's father or by the groom himself to the bride's father or brothers. It was a prenuptial transaction between two families and was not paid all at one time. In principle, the bride was paid in money and movable property, and only rarely did that include land. Gifts were often given to a daughter by her father, and also from her husband and his father. Combined with the dowry, in this way, the daughter, on the occasion of her marriage, might acquire considerable and varied property. The bride price and gifts were particularly important for early Israel because, unlike our modern understanding of marriage and marital fidelity, monogamy was not the only type of marriage construct. Although monogamy was the type of marriage most familiar in our society, it may have been a rather ineffective arrangement for the perpetuation of the family in Iron Age Palestine. Said differently, the more childbearing wives a man had, the better positioned he was economically and socially. Biological and sociological circumstances undoubtedly impacted reproduction, and this meant that literally laying one's eggs in one basket may not have been the most effective way of producing the requisite large family to manage the subsistence needs of a family in early Israel. male impotence, female infertility, the fact that multiple pregnancies surely diminish life expectancies of a woman. A woman in Iron Age 1 would have had nearly 2 pregnancies for every child who survived to the age of 5. And harsh working conditions, coupled with the nearly continuous sequence of pregnancies, such that the risk of death throughout multiple pregnancies was significant. These factors conspired to create a situation where one monogamous nuclear family may not produce enough offspring or progeny. There are several different options by means of which a family may cope with the absence of progeny. The biblical text provides examples of serial monogamy. A man divorces a barren woman in an attempt to marry a fertile one. Polygyny, taking additional wives of equal status. Polycoity, taking concubines or handmaidens who are not equal in status to the primary wife. And adoption. Marriage was important. Marriage was an important custom for the ancient Israelites because it managed the maintenance of the land within a particular kinship grouping via the reproduction of progeny. Marriage, then, performs a significant function in the economics of kinship, as the family household is a social unit that maintains generational continuity. Decisions about property, transmission, and inheritance have a direct bearing on the shape of the family household and on family members' behavior. Said differently, inheritance arrangements help explain family behavior, and much of this behavior centers around land and land tenure. Land and land tenure were critical. As you turn to your readings, I encourage you to do so with an eye towards social units and how they may have been constructed around land and land tenure. You're now familiar with the physical environmental markers for the early Israelites living in the hills of Palestine and the major social units depicted in the stories of the patriarchs. You've also been introduced to the idea of marriage with an eye towards this custom's concern for the issue of land and land tenure. You're now ready to engage the stories of the patriarchs as found in the book of Genesis. Thank you.